Thank you so much for having me. For those of you, and many of you who don't know me, I was born and raised in Tanzania, and I left at 16. And ever since, I've lived in 3 different continents. But I spent most of my adult life in Australia. And as you can probably tell, this session is going to be in English. I have been trying to learn Swedish. I've been here for 2 years. But every time I get around to using vowels, I'm stuck. I retract and I give up. I was so desperate the other day that I looked at an X-ray image of somebody speaking Swedish so I can pronounce the vowels and look at the tongue. Yeah, it was hard. But I hear speaking Swedish is part of integrating in Sweden. And also not talking about controversial topics, which this is, so maybe I'm not doing that well. But yeah, I guess I have a career in stand-up comedy. Great. There's no better way to start this conversation on religious trauma. Once I find my mouse. Oh, not that way. There we go. Then to talk about Faithless Hijabi. One of the main programs Faithless Hijabi has is the mental health program. We started it during COVID when mental health online sessions, therapy sessions were popularized. And ever since, we've helped over 110 ex-Muslims with minimal funding. We provide therapy for free for ex-Muslims, and primarily those who are located in the Middle East, where therapy comes at a risk. Opening up to your therapist, even confidential, comes at a risk. They not only go through conversion therapy if they're gay, but are often told to pray more. So in order to outsource this and be there and make it accessible, but also free, we started the program. As you can see our stats, I work in analytics, so I love numbers. And most of the people we have are women, but increasingly, especially this year, we've had a lot of men joining in and coming out as well. And over half of the people that we have come from the LGBTQ plus community. The average age is quite young, 18 to 25, and 65% of them are in the Middle East. Is it the volume? Is this better? But maybe I can go on. And we have around 14 therapists or / clinics partnered all across the globe. To begin with, I guess maybe I should ask, how many people here come from religious background and have left versus being raised in a secular home? A show of hands? Okay, thank you. So if you ever relate to the topic, I think it'll be comforting to kind of see the similarities we have, like Ulf mentioned. But at any point, if anything I've written or said does not make sense, please raise your hand and I will translate it. Or maybe not translate, but explain it further. Religious trauma is defined as psychological distress or emotional suffering resulting from harmful or oppressive religious beliefs and practices or experiences. It often manifests when individuals are surrounded by a tightly knit community who see their religious path as the sole truth and everybody else as evil or misguided. And efforts are made to create that separation between the outside world and their world. It takes root in childhood, making it challenging for many individuals to distance themselves from their religious upbringing without feeling like they're abandoning everything that they were taught. It's a very isolating process. But is it different for ex-Muslims? I know I've heard a lot of things that probably ex-Muslims have a complete different experience, and that sometimes it only affects ex-Muslims who live in Muslim-majority countries because of the obvious apostasy, death penalty, or for being gay. But I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you understand that we do have a lot of overlap, and there are obviously some unique challenges. At the same time, it doesn't only affect those that live in the Muslim majority countries. Our numbers indicate otherwise as well. We have a lot of people from Europe and the UK who are unable to find safe spaces to get therapy in the first place. I'm not sure if everybody can read this, but I'll give you a minute to kind of read through some of the responses or inquiries I've had in the last 2 months. It's a good summary of what people come to us with, people from the Middle East. I'm going to move to the next slide. I summarized some of the feelings and emotions that people have. A lot of these are interrelated. A lot of them go hand in hand with different emotions, and they're often quite complex as well. But for this session, we'll talk about 3 different ones that I thought were quite interesting and I could personally relate to as well. Guilt, identity, and grief. Starting with guilt. We're taught wrong from right with the fear of hell. It's a very black and white thinking, and that there is no other way. You're either right or wrong, and all your decisions are judged across that. With that, the concept of sin and shame. Guilt can be associated with the notion that anything that you're doing that religious obligations don't agree with or are perceived as wrong in religious teaching is sinful, and that does bring about shame even years after you've left. It's really hard to undo the mindset that comes with it. Internal criticism. People who receive constant criticism from their churches or mosques, the way you dress, the way you act, the way you talk, who you talk to. I think you develop over years, you start judging yourself a little more. Things like prioritizing yourself, setting boundaries with unhealthy family members are known to be selfish. Expectations. And this is probably one that I carried on for the longest, feeling guilty due to religious expectations placed on by family or the community, the fear of being judged and condemned by others, especially if they feel like they've not met expectations. And for many ex-Muslims, this has to do with honor. I think a lot of us have heard about honor killing, and we're probably quite familiar of what happens to individuals when they go out of line in families that believe in honor. It is quite common in societies where they're collectivists versus individualists. So a lot of the Middle Eastern cultures have a lot of community-based structures. The idea of honor is being raised with valuing your parents' honor, your family's honor over your own individual liberty. The belief that you owe your parents for your upbringing. And a lot of family members, without even getting to the physical abuse part, start employing emotional guilt tactics and manipulate you into adhering to religious norms. And as a result, ex-Muslims face a lot of pressure to conform. For myself, I left wearing the hijab when I was 18, so about 5 years before I was an ex-Muslim. And it came with a lot of baggage. I didn't live in Tanzania at the time, I was in Australia, but that also meant that my family placed certain restrictions on me, which was, you can't tell anyone, you shouldn't post photos, wear it when you visit Tanzania. And there were a lot of strings attached to it. It took us years to start putting boundaries and kind of putting myself first. Even with leaving Islam, When I left Islam and I knew that I wasn't going to be silent about it, I disowned my family. I did it the other way around because I was genuinely scared about what would happen to them in Tanzania. Because I left, I know that it can fall upon people hurting them. So if I told everyone that I'm no longer in touch with my family, I thought that maybe they would be spared. But that wasn't the case. My family suffered quite immensely as a result. They were ostracized from the community quite subtly. Nobody would actually say anything. But my sister, who's 16 now and was like 12 at the time, was bullied in school. We changed 3 schools and she was constantly getting harassed by people from my community. My brother, who went through a divorce and is still going through a divorce, the reason it took longer was the community leaders funded his wife, his ex-wife, and paid for lawyers and kept harassing them. And it's still going on, and it has a lot to do with who I am. When I visited Tanzania, and I was picking up my niece from Islamic school, and I was outside the gates waiting for her, my brother got an official call saying, "Your sister cannot be here, she's not a Muslim." But, other non-Muslims were fine, but she can't be here. And it was discriminatory, and Tanzania is a secular country, so you can't really say no to people on public grounds. But that was kind of like my family had to go through this journey with me. And I think for them it was quite surprising because they're still Muslims. But because of me and me ruining their honor, I think it was a good lesson to kind of see who your actual family friends are. And of course, for me, it came with a lot of guilt that maybe I shouldn't have left Islam, that maybe I should have stayed silent. Identity. Growing up with strict religious practices, people tend to conflate what you learn as religious culture and your ethnic culture to be one. I do think I think culture and religion are intertwined, but not quite so. And that brings me to kind of explain it a bit more. Things like celebrations, Eid, Ramadan, wedding, funerals, anything that bring people close together were done in accordance of religious obligations. For instance, in weddings where people should be sitting as a family, there was a segregation between men and women. The bride always had to wear a hijab, even though it's her wedding day. And if she didn't, people could not sit, the men could not see her. And because her parents were sitting, or her dad was sitting in a different place, in a different segregation, they couldn't be there for their daughter's wedding. Religion also provides a framework for many to live by. From birth to afterlife, we're told what will happen to you and when you don't do it, what will happen to you as well. But which is your role is you serve God, you live for God, you spread God's message. And that's all you should be doing for your entire life. I mean, yes, you can study, but essentially you're going to heaven if you spread the word of God, if you convert Muslims. But also your role as a family member and an individual. They can be quite distorted when you leave because there are certain restrictions on maybe a father should be the guardian, the male guardian for their adult daughter as well. So when you leave religion, all of these are really hard to break out of. I think this is probably more important as well. Sexuality, who we love, who we marry, and who we are. If it's not heteronormative or heterosexual relationships, it is condemned. If it's not after marriage, it is condemned. But also the added burden of living in countries where it is punishable by death. So when we stop believing, we have this gap from what religion gave us and finding our path forward. And that takes a long time because now you're unlearning all the toxic ideas, you're learning new ideas, but you're also learning to formulate. And yes, maybe not all atheists have a continuous free-thinking process, but for many of us who have been in the field constantly battling and proving that we shouldn't be killed for our apostasy, but also we're constantly battled with Muslims, even moderate Muslims, telling us that it had nothing to do with us having moral or ethical reasons for leaving Islam. It had a lot to do with our experiences. I mean, yes and no, but when you're constantly put in the battlefield to explain yourself, it can be quite confusing, it can be quite hurtful, and actually quite damaging to your mental health, because you're trying to employ or you're trying to safeguard your ideas. And sometimes there's a while where we don't know a lot of things, including existential questions like the meaning of life and what happens now, what do we do after this? On culture and identity, for me, it was, well, a lot of ex-Muslims come from different regions, from East Asia to the Middle East and Africa. For me, who has been like probably a 5th, 6th generation immigrant in Tanzania, all I knew was to be Tanzanian. It was never about my skin color, but the practices were not African. It didn't have any music. It didn't have any celebrations that were not only Islamic. And for some people who've come from radical Islam, you aren't allowed to celebrate birthdays either. So was that the culture, or was that the upbringing that somebody should still keep? Or do we find out and get in touch with our roots that do have music, that do have dancing? And sexuality. This might not apply to me personally, but I've worked with a lot of ex-Muslims who are gay, who are lesbian, who are bi, but been unable to accept who they are. They're not okay with their bodies. They don't know what they should be going when they go on dates or talk to the same sex. It comes with a lot of trauma and baggage, to a point that they push them away because they think their very existence is sinful. They should not exist, or they should be celibate, because otherwise they're committing a sin. And of course, in many Muslim majority countries, but not limited to, in a lot of Africa as well, it's a criminal offense. So in Tanzania, if I was living there and I was an LGBT plus activist, I would be jailed for 10 years, just for being an activist. But I guess a lot of us know that it's already happening in Uganda. A crackdown in East of Africa is quite prominent. Grief. This was hardest for me to accept, and it was actually I had a Muslim therapist as soon as I left Islam, because I wasn't sure who could relate to me. That wasn't the best ideas, but I learned a few things. I was feeling incredibly sad or hurt or just abandoned. And even though I felt so liberated, I felt like I knew some part of the truth, I was still held back. And there were a lot of things. One of them was losing my family or community. I know my family and I have a good relationship, and it was my decision to walk away at the time. But the friends that I've known for a very long time, went to kindergarten together, we went to school together, all of them suddenly just stopped talking to me. Even those who weren't very religious, even those who, in my opinion, had committed a lot of sins at the time than I did, they just stopped talking to me, and it was confusing. It made me question all of my friends. Are these people who were just with me because I was religious and I conformed? Please let me know when it's time, so that I'm not going over. Yeah, thank you. 5 minutes? Oh, wow, I have a lot more.
Okay, take time.
Oh, okay. I need 10 minutes, so I'm gonna be really fast.
But also, if you could speak a bit slower, so take longer time then.
Okay, cool. Grieving the past. We spent a lot of times believing in miracles, things that we thought were right, that women must be covered, that gay people are going to hell. And it's quite embarrassing that it took me 23 years to realize that this was not true. When I was 14, I created a version of what Islam looked like in my head, because I truly wanted to believe that I was in the right religion, but also that I was compassionate towards other people. Because there's an often misquoted verse, which is, there's no compulsion in Islam. And it's so misquoted, but I kept believing that everybody's going to go to heaven. They'll only be in hell for a short time if they're gay or, if they commit sins. And it was horrible. I think when I look back, I'm just sad at how long it took me and that it should have happened sooner. Loss of belief. When we talked about the framework, religion gave us a lot of comfort where this is what things are, this is how things are going to happen, and this is where your life is going to be revolving around. And it gave us the comfort, a safe haven. But when we lose that, it can be quite hard. It's not the religion itself, but it's the idea of belonging to something, a bigger idea, a bigger meaning. And when we're navigating uncertainty, it can be quite scary. To summarize, I found this post just the other day on Instagram, and I thought it was quite relevant to what I was talking here, so I put it up. And please follow them if you want to. It's two psychotherapists who are from ex-Christian communities. I'll read it out. Grief isn't just for death. It's also for losing yourself, releasing who you once were, having to start over, years lost in religion, not knowing who you are now, losing certainty, the loss of community, and being disowned by your family. The grief for ex-Muslims, it's also losing our home, our homeland. Like myself, I can never go back to Tanzania. I was arrested 3 years ago. And most importantly, our safety. I have a protected identity in Sweden, and it's made life really hard. And this is in a Western country, but even in the UK, I had to make sure I never used my address to ship anything to myself. But that's also tied in with a bit of fear, where it does really kind of make sense that a lot of us, even in Europe, who have had families here, have been threatened for just being an ex-Muslim, because a lot of Muslims are insulted by our existence. Not just us talking about Islam, but also just being there as apostate, as living proof that people can leave. But is it different for women? I think so. In cultures or societies where there's systematic based discrimination and oppression, a few things like adhering to modesty laws, restricted bodily autonomy, and enforced gender roles can result in restriction to contraception, subjected to FGM. And for those who don't know what FGM is, it's female genital mutilation. It is the partial or full cutting of a woman's clitoris. No, sorry, not a woman, a child's clitoris. Mandatory hijab, not just in Iran, even here. Forced marriage, not just in the Middle East, even in Europe, but also being prevented from working and studying. Even in the US, where education is mandatory, a lot of people will employ things like home study to prevent girls from mixing with boys, to keep us in a segregated area. I wanted to maybe very quickly, and this is the end, highlight a part of our mental health program that is quite important. Usually when we talk about a mental health program, we look at testimonials from people who have received support. But I wanted to turn it around and look at testimonials from our therapists who are really making this work and what their experience is. We have 14 of them from the US, UK, and Lebanon, who speak English, Arabic, Farsi, and a lot of them give us very discounted rates, more than half, and that's why we need a lot more therapists, because it can't be sustainable for them. Some of the things they told us when they gave their feedback, and not everybody is an ex-Muslim, as from our therapists. We have Muslim therapists and we have non-Muslim therapists as well. On leaving religion, it opens up new possibilities and necessities, a process of world building, things that we never realized could exist outside of our minds, and that is helped through therapy. It often serves as a platform to feel validated and exploring hidden insight. It tells you everything you already know, but from another person's perspective as well. But it can also result in various forms of trauma, such as physical and emotional abuse, eating disorders, anxiety, phobias. But it can manifest in very different ways for many different people. I'm going to read this out for you. This was from our therapist, Emily. One such example of this that I found particularly confronting was when a gay client asked me to heal their trauma so they can become straight again. In a Western society, it is possible to embody your true sexuality and live and express it freely, even if there may be personal cost to personal family relationships. There is a cultural tolerance of openness. For clients still living in religious strict society, openly rejecting ideological norms or being gay can still be life-threatening. Helping someone come to terms with accepting themselves as they are, but understanding that they may never be safe to truly live authentically is an anathema to most Western therapeutic approaches. I don't have time, but I was going to tell you a story about a Somali minor who's a British citizen who was kidnapped. But maybe we can skip that for now. How you can support us? If you scan the QR code, you'll obviously go to our support page. We are on very minimal funds, as you can imagine. Being an ex-Muslim, even in Sweden, was quite rejected for many of our grant applications because we use the term ex-Muslims. And I don't want to not use it because I think it's very important. So please donate, spread it to other people, and let others know that we exist and that we'd like to support them. That's it for me.